Module 8, the Incarnation and Ministry of Jesus. I'm so glad to get to this point in the classes. We might wonder, why did we have to wait until the 8th class to get here? I think we're simply doing honor to the story of Old Testament salvation and now to New Testament salvation, because what we don't want to do is just jump from Genesis 3 to Matthew 26 and have Jesus pay the penalty of our sin and be done with it. That would be, well, let's bring up proposition number 1. That's my proposition, that we can't jump like that to do honor to our story. Jesus came, number 1, Jesus came not to pay a price, but to live a life. He didn't, think of this, go out into the wilderness and commit suicide. I mean, if I was told I was going to be be in the hands of Gentiles and crucified, I wouldn't go through with it, in the sense my first thought would be, I'm going to leave and take care of it myself. Jesus knew he couldn't do that. In other words, there's a bigger story going on here than paying a price. And I think it's a detriment to our theology that we'd ever use payment language, frankly, in how we think of Jesus' death. His entrance into the New Testament kept the Old Testament story moving forward. He will save his people from their sins, but that's a story of a life, not a death. So again, this is he died, or Adam sinned, Jesus dies, and we get to go to heaven. That would be the truncated, flattened version, shall we say, of how to think of salvation. I love N.T. Wright's quote. This is a paraphrase. It would be as a Christian pilgrimage in this diagram by helicopter, arriving in heaven as pilgrims with suspiciously clean feet. We don't want to do that. We want to get our feet nice and dirty in the story, because it is a story that takes all of Scripture. So instead of that A plus B equals C, yes, Adam sinned, yes, Jesus died, and yes, the new creation, heaven itself, is coming. But let's move through the story. In fact, think of the life that Jesus lived. We'll talk about his death as a completely separate module next time. We'll spend an entire discussion on the meaning of Jesus' death, because it's huge. But right now, we want to talk about the life of Jesus that is taking us through this story. Remember, when Gabriel said he will save his people from their sins, he's not quoting an Old Testament text. He's explaining a story to Mary and Joseph that is his rendition of what Jesus will do. And so it's a big moment in Matthew 1 there when he says this. And of course, what he means is the sins of disloyalty that has taken the nation into exile is going to be turned around. All right, proposition number 2. John's Gospel, the book of John, let's talk about Jesus' identity. Who is he? Describe Jesus as a unique deity who was present with Yahweh during the original creation of the world. This non-created spirit, Jesus before the incarnation was a non-created spirit being, and he becomes, this is incarnation, incarnatio in Latin means to take on flesh. He becomes human. So let's just take a few moments in this proposition and talk about, this will be the only place we do it, who is Jesus? How would you describe him if you walked up to him in the days of his flesh? Here is John 1:18. It's the text that has caught our attention. It depends on your version. So let me show you 1, 2, 3 versions there, 4, 5, 6. These are, and the reason I'm showing you these is to show you how difficult it is to translate this passage based on, notice the cosmology that each of these Bible translators are using. That's why our first module was cosmology. How is the scenery set up so that we know how to position the players when they show up on stage? Well, let's go through this, and let's strip off the first line, no one has ever seen God. That's common in all the texts. They all get that. That's not hard. And let's strip off the back end. He has made him known. He has revealed him. Here are all 6 texts with that middle portion that's the tough part to translate, okay? Notice how, again, different they all are. The only begotten Son, the only one himself, God. It is God, the only Son, God, the one and only. I mean, you must say to yourself, if you're comparing versions, and I'd recommend you always have in these Bible programs that you can, again, these software programs that we can buy, like Logos or Accordance, you have 30 different versions. packed in usually, and so you can in a moment compare versions. When you see something this diverse, you say to yourself, the Greek must be throwing a curveball at us, because how do you come up with so different and divergent sounding statements? Well, here's the interesting thing. It's not a difficult Greek translation. Monogenes, theos are the first two words that we have there. The rest is pretty simple. Monogenes, theos, who is in the bosom of the Father. Let's not worry about the bosom part of the Father for now, because that's, again, a common sense idea that, well, common sense, it's very symbolic. It's where it's bosom or lap or interior of. It's as though, I like to use this illustration, if I'm creating pens and I boom, 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 everyone gets a pen. And then I go, oh, I got one more. And I take one out of my bosom, not created. It was always there. And I show him to the world. That seems to be the picture there, that God is pulling from, symbolically, his bosom, someone to give the world. What's at stake here are, again, all those versions that we just saw, and the gymnastics that they're going through come out of two words, monogenes, theos. Well, do monogenes first. It's a fairly common term. It in the olden days, people thought it meant only begotten. I think evidence has shown that we didn't know the background, the lexical background of the word monogenes. And so the modern versions, more modern versions, seem to catch that we're really talking about one of a species, or really unique beings, so that Isaac is Abraham's monogenes son. Well, he's not his firstborn, so it can't be only begotten, right? Ishmael counts. So monogenes is, most versions will admit, most commentators will admit, that monogenes today, the best translation of it is simply unique, one of a kind. The word theos, again, just means, you know this from our cosmology, right? Elohim, theos, it's just everything above the horizon. Doesn't matter who. Satan is the theos of this world, 2 Corinthians 4. Yahweh is the theos of Israel. The point is that theos is just a categorization of what it is to be above the line of the horizon. So far, so good, right? So all we're saying is that the text says he is a unique deity. And I'd recommend that's as simple as it gets. Monogenes theos, in the bosom of the Father. He is a unique, again, I like that illustration so far as it works. God can create spirits, but then he takes out of his bosom someone to give to the world and show him off. That's, I think, what the picture of that verse is trying to show. Well, my obvious question, and it should be any of ours, is, well, come on, guys, why can't you just say it? How in the world does the RSV go, it is God the only Son? What in the, well, there's a textual issue that some want to bring in, but the evidence is strong that that word is not there. God, the one and only. What does that even mean? The only God who is the only God. Well, that's getting close, ESV. But again, are we saying he's the only, or better, monogenes doesn't mean only, it means unique. Unique among a other group. So anyway, here's where I'd say, let's do our homework of going back to the cosmology that we saw first class and say, in their world, this is the world of John, when you look above the horizon, they're theoi all up there. In our definition, of course, we've made Yahweh the high God in their world, the Most High, they called him. Well, let's ask the question, why doesn't the version just say unique deity? I think if you look at the text itself, you'll see how John 1 can really help us out. In the beginning was the Word. This is a kind of philosophical statement that Plato even, or Philo even used. The word concept means something that you can give to an audience that represents you. So let's just go with that for now. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with, and the article is there, the theos, and the Word was theos. He, now we know the Word is a human, he was in the beginning with the theos. What does that say to you? To me, it just has, like I show up there, that we have a theos who was with the theos. Why can we have two theoi? We've already had theoi. That's the point. If you're a version and you're trying to translate John 1:18 and you don't believe in plural Elohim, which again, most denominations don't, you're stuck. You don't know what to do. That's why you go through the conundrum of the one and only God kind of stuff. But if you start your thinking with the cosmology of plural theoi being part of the world that they all had, then you have no trouble saying that Jesus was with the theos and he was a theos. He was in the beginning with the theos. And of course, from that, now we can draw in that very thick yellow line of creator and created. Remember how we did this? Everything above this line is uncreated. Everything below the line is created. The end of John 1:3 tells us in no uncertain terms that when God, as it were, pulled out a theos from his bosom and handed it to us, he didn't create him. He was in the beginning with the theos, and all things were made through him. This table was made, this is amazing to me. This table was made by Yahweh. Of course, we stuck it together, but he made it through Jesus. That's a big idea, right? And yet that's what John 1, we're only 3 verses into John, and we have one of the most amazing ideas already on our plate. So I just think the text is pretty clear. Now, when did they know this? I think Peter didn't know it. I think James and John didn't know it. I think if you had asked the disciples, who is Jesus? Would they have come up with, well, he's a unique deity? No one says that. That's the point. So Peter, I think, saw him as the Messiah. Son of God is not a term of deity. It just means God's chosen one. So that term is not a deity word. And so my guess is, from all the evidence of his days on earth, that they wondered how his relationship with Yahweh was, I'm sure, but they probably didn't think in terms of John 1:18 until John writes this, of course, a generation later. Let me just, just to be kind of summarize this. What is his relationship to Yahweh? We always wonder this, and as Erickson says, this is a standard theologian today. One of the most controversial subjects, of course, is the deity of Christ. It is at the same time one of the most crucial. It's strange to have something crucial that's that difficult, but that's how we've phrased it. It lies at the heart of our faith, for our faith rests on Jesus actually being God in human flesh. Here's the problem, as you see. As soon as you start getting capital letters, if I were to say, well, what do you mean by that word? What does that word mean in English? Is that Yahweh? No, because again, think of how our cosmology works. Yahweh isn't Elohim. He is a theos. But if I capitalize the letter G, can I stick that on Yahweh? In other words, we've created a dilemma for ourselves when we start using capital letters. That's why I recommended, remember back at the beginning, always take off the capitals just so you know how they thought. You're not disrespecting God by doing that. You're trying to think like the writers. And I think if a modern, or if an apostle saw this word and he knew English, he'd say, what do you mean by God, G-O-D? I'm not sure I understand the use of that term in English compared to how we use the word theos. While Jesus' combination, let me just summarize it this way. This is my own thoughts. While Jesus' combination of humanity and deity was never a discussion point, philosophically, his relationship to Yahweh, the chief deity of Israel, did provoke continual exploration. For time immemorial, we've wondered, what was his relationship to Yahweh? Here's my quick summation of what I know from the text. We can say, number one, he's a unique deity. That's right out of John 1:18. In that he was with Yahweh at the creation of the world, which indicates he himself is uncreated. I think we have to go with that. Number two, he is continuously loyal to the Father. One of the things that you'll notice in the text is his complete dependence on Yahweh for everything. And he'll talk about that a lot. Number three, he's uniquely loved by the Father, a doctrine we don't often talk about, but it's about a dozen verses. That God loves me and I love him. He loves me, the one, my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. That kind of language sounds a bit, poetic, but it's deeply rooted in God's absolute love for Jesus in some, shall I even say, mysterious way. It's beautiful, but hard to understand. And number 4, he has been positioned. This is the one thing we learned from Daniel 7, positioned by the Father to receive honor from all humans and divine beings. So, well, let's move on to proposition 3. It's easy to stop when we're talking about who Jesus is, but we'll move on. Number 3 in our conversation of the incarnation of Jesus, the existence of righteous people. We've seen this, but I want to just clarify. From Jesus' childhood confirms the Old Testament story that we've had before. Righteousness is available to anyone who worships Yahweh. So we had that picture, remember, of the Old Testament saying, are we ready for people to be righteous like Isaac and Jacob prior to the coming of Jesus? Well, let's move this whole thing to the side and stick in Zacharias and Elizabeth. And remember that the text says they are both dikaios, the Greek term that mirrors tzedakah in Hebrew. They're righteous. And this isn't just a kind of a nice thing of, oh, they're nice people, they pay their taxes and have a nice dog and take care of it. This is actually saying a theological point, that they were right with God. And notice they're the ones who are living even before the baby Jesus is born. So we've got to have that in our story for this to make sense. Number 4, did you know that we only have 52 days of Jesus' life even recorded? Less than 2 months of our Savior's life is recorded for us in the Bible. Many of those days were spent confronting gods who, under Satan's rule, wielded physical control. Again, it's easy to miss this if we think that gods don't exist and demons do. That makes no sense whatsoever. Demons are gods. Read Deuteronomy 33. Read Psalm 106. Demons, Elohim. That's the same concept to them. So when Jesus walks into a synagogue in Mark 1 and meets a man who has a demon, that's the Greek word that is equivalent to a God of the first commandment. It's quite an amazing moment when they have a confrontation. Well, of course, it all starts when the devil and Jesus have this, what we call the temptation. I like to call it the concession of Satan. I've even scratched that out in my Bible. You know how you have subtitles to your chapters, and it says the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4. I crossed mine off one day and I just wrote what I think it is. This is when Satan is defeated. The moment he goes down happens right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But notice what Satan says to Jesus. All this authority I will give you, remember the third temptation, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me. He's quoting Deuteronomy 32. Jesus, you know who has control of this world. Yahweh gave it to me. So how in the world are you standing here thinking you're going to get it back? I give it to whomever I wish. It's my word that's going to win here. Well, you know how the story ends there. Jesus defeats him. A couple chapters later, chapter 10, Jesus is telling his disciples to not fear Satan and his horde and what these gods can do, because Jesus says, I saw Satan fall down in front of me and give up. Fall prostrate is the actual word there. I saw him fall down. I guarantee, by the way, and notice how that story ends, all the power of the enemy is now gone. I have won that battle, and so I'm still going to allow him to do his thing in some ways. You'll still have to contend with him, but whoever won this battle, is no doubt about it, I won. Okay? So that does bring up this exorcism thing, and I think, again, just to make the salvation story full and clear, it's just good to take a couple minutes and talk about them. What was an exorcism? What does that mean? We may now understand why there were no recorded demonic exorcism in the Old Testament. It stands to reason that evil spirits would have felt comfortable in the surroundings of Canaan. I remember when Joshua goes in, they worship the gods of Canaan. They're not having trouble. The gods aren't controlling those people because they were covenanting with them. I once was a janitor back in college, and I would go into this beautiful restaurant every morning, 5 a.m., to clean the kitchen. I would flick the lights, and the cockroaches would go. And I always thought of this when Jesus walks into a synagogue in Canaan or in Israel. I sense that the demons in the room would go like that. all of a sudden the lights would come on when Jesus would walk in a room. You can see this in the text quite often. They felt comfortable in the surroundings of Canaan among the lost that Jesus came to save. This was their home territory, allotted to them by the God of Israel. So while we may hear of the periodic story where a God is silenced or shamed, we have them, we would not expect demon exorcism as part of the Old Testament story. Exorcisms surface in the Gospels because the truly authoritative human being, the unique deity, Daniel 7, all those things, the light is turned on and the cockroaches scatter. After Satan falls prostrate in front of Jesus, demons consistently describe Jesus with uncanny accuracy. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? He's quoting Jeremiah 10, which is a promise that the gods of the nations will be destroyed. The demon is quoting a text to Jesus, saying, I know why you're here. Again, I'd love to think like demons well, maybe I shouldn't, but to think a divine thought like that, or like anything, or I'm human, I think human thoughts. To think a divine thought, I guess we can't do, but here's as close as we can get. We can hear him thinking Jeremiah 10:11. And by the way, notice that next verse, this comes, one chapter later, and it's only in Mark, so it's easy to miss this one. If you were living in Israel, every now and then in the distance, you'd see someone just go, boom. And then the man would keep walking over here. And then this man, as he turns a corner, another person would go, boom, like that. Well, this is what's going on. And the unclean spirits, whenever, I think this is trying to say, guys, this happened all the time. Every other Tuesday, I was watching them, we had this happen where they fell down. People were about, what this is? This is the story that Paul then tells later in 1 Timothy 3. Remember, we saw this at the very beginning of our lectures. The story of the Bible is God coming, or a theos that was with Yahweh is coming to the earth, and he was witnessed by deities. That's one of the 6 lines that makes your religion, that makes you. This is the doctrine of salvation in the sense of what Jesus does to gain it. And notice how important that is to the story. And that's all part of the exorcisms story. Proposition 5, in the main, Jesus' ministry was dedicated, think of what he does day to day, in explaining what it meant to be truly human, under the watch, care, and love of Yahweh. He is not, I think Jesus is sitting at the top of a mountain in a sense, and all the philosophers of the world and sages and wise men are circling to various degrees that same mountain, getting higher and higher possibly. And every now and then someone gets to the top and thinks they've figured out what it means to be human, and Jesus is sitting there the whole time. That's how I read many of the things he says. In other words, it's not against human reason. It's the height of human reason. And so Matthew 5-7, if you want to know what it's like to be really human, be meek, loving, kind, forgive your enemies. Those are the things Jesus is trying to say. I don't think they were stunning. I mean, take it the right way. I don't think people would say, what? I've never heard of being kind before. No, they were saying, oh, so that's what it means to follow Yahweh, to just become human in how I act. And I like to give just a brief thought there. Then this would be, again, something I wish I could do if I could time warp myself backwards. It would be to sit at the fireside with Jesus at night around the campfire and just talk and hear him explain what it's like to be the unique deity that's in the bosom of the Father. Jesus spent much of his ministry just being godly and kind, explaining to others how simple it was to become a member of God's family. That's how you be righteous again. Unlike the pagan world systems around him, Galilee had Gentiles in it, a lot of Gentiles. That's why he's probably rubbing shoulders with a lot of pagans. Jesus taught that ideas such as meekness, humility, and love were the means of inheriting the earth. That's not a religious idea, that's a human idea. It's just a common sense idea, living successfully whether of this world or the next. Halfway down, it is interesting to note that at no time in Jesus' life does the story describe him as observing the ceremonial laws of Moses. You don't hear him ever sacrificing. You don't hear of Jesus ever. Now, again, his parents had him circumcised at 8 days and things like that. But I don't feel that Jesus was, in fact, sometimes he would go into a field and say, hey, it's Saturday, let's pick some grain. In other words, he would do things purposely to annoy the Pharisees who are not Yahwists anyway. So I don't sense, and this is a debating point for some reason, I don't know why it is, because I think the text is clear. He is not intending at all to follow the laws of Moses. They were for a time, 900-year sub-story, ended in 586, and he had no, in his mind, business trying to follow the legalistic laws of the ceremonial side of Moses' laws. Primarily, Jesus' command to follow him was designed to bring people into loyalty to Yahweh. Don't ever forget this. In these texts, I didn't take the time to write out, but every one of them, this is just in Matthew. It's where Jesus does something and then he says, the will of my Father, the will of my Father. Or I love the 1531. He does a miracle and everyone worships or praises the God of Israel. Well, that's Yahweh. Was Jesus offended that when he did a miracle, people praised Yahweh? He would say, that's why I'm here. I'm the Messiah to get you to undo the sins of disloyalty that our nation has been falling prey to for these generations. And when I hear you praise Yahweh, sign me up. That's why I came. And that's why, again, when we worship Jesus on a Sunday morning, we're doing it to the honor of the Father. It doesn't end with Jesus. He would not be satisfied with that. He wants us to honor the Father through him. So again, the picture of moving from Adam to heaven goes through the cross, but it goes through Jesus. And when you hear him talk, there is, in fact, I did put them on the screen. Good. Yeah, they praise the God of Israel. I'm glad I put this up here. Notice again in these verses, Jesus would not be offended that he caught you loving Yahweh. That would be his whole point of ministry. Number 6. It was somewhat expected that Jesus would tell his disciples to not go to the Gentiles. What a strange moment. Remember this? Is it Luke 10? Don't go to the Gentile. Well, why? I'm just going to say, think story. Think story. He was joining a story in progress, and that story at this point is we got to work through the Jew first before we get to the Gentile. Why only go to the Jews? Well, it made complete sense to those who were standing there. I think they would have said, right, that's how we do this. We go to the family of Abraham. It was Abraham's family alone which would be blessed. So he's simply living up to the story of what a Messiah would do. And by the way, if you look at it carefully, there is no recorded incident of Jesus seeking out a Gentile. Now, you do have Gentiles coming to him, and I think that's the beauty of the story. And we'll talk about that in a moment. How he handles the Gentile who works through the crowd of Jews to get to him. That's a great element of the Jesus story. Number 7, yet Jesus' most powerful teaching, here it is, concerned the inclusion of the other, the lost, into the family of Israel, provided, of course, they worship Yahweh. Always keep that in mind. He's not just welcoming everyone to heaven or into, the family. As long as you love Yahweh, you're in. Now, until this point, they weren't thinking that way, but Jesus is going to change the way, he wants to change the way they think. So then why do we include Gentiles? Why would Jesus turn, as it were, and welcome the Samaritan woman to this conversation? Clearly, Jesus did minister to Gentiles and to the other. Some of his most powerful stories, like the Roman centurion, the Syrophoenician woman, and so forth, these encounters were done with a wink, I call it. In other words, think of this. I'm saying, only go to the Jew. And the Jew is saying, yeah, this because you're our Messiah, we're going to get rid of the Gentile. Here comes this woman who falls at my feet and says, can I have the crumbs that fall off the table? If I'm Jesus, I look around making sure you're hearing this, and I say, I can't give you the food of my family. And she says, oh, just the crumbs. And again, it's almost like with a wink. Oh, I've never heard such faith, loyalty in Israel. See what he's doing is taking a moment. He's storytelling. In fact, that's my next line there at the very bottom and the top of this screen. Jesus was storytelling. His supposed intention of avoiding Gentiles was being altered by that woman who worked through the crowd. And he honored her and said, I have never seen such loyalty among all these guys standing around me. And what a teaching moment that was. So sometimes teaching is best done when it's a shock value to the audience, and they'll never forget what happened that day. It made it into our Bibles when a woman said, I know I'm not a Jew, but I want to be part of the family, even if I'm a dog in the family. What about ritual impurity? I've had this conversation with my friends. I don't think I talked with Mike about it. It'd be fun to get his view. Well, he knows he knows what's the right view now. But here's my understanding. While ritual impurity was thought to disqualify a person from intimate contact with the deity, right? If you're ritually impure, stay away. Jesus openly touched impure people to demonstrate the inaccuracy of that thinking, right? Now, here's the other side. People have said, and almost every commentary does this, Jesus touched the dead boy, and then, but remember the woman had a dead son, I think it was, and he touched the bier upon which the dead person was. And of course, you can't do that as a Jew. You can't touch a dead body, a corpse, according to Mosaic law. And the argument comes in the commentaries, well, Jesus was a cleaner. In other words, when he touched it, he purified it by his touch. I would say no, there's no evidence of that, based on what I'll say in a moment. But two, I think Jesus is just saying, guys, it's a body. Come on, think past where you've been in this story and get to normal life. In fact, well, let me read it here. Far from giving anyone the impression that this was his divine privilege, Jesus taught his disciples. Here's the point. He touched the bier and he said, hey guys, come over here, touch it. And of course, they're going, no way, I'm a Jew. And Jesus is saying, you don't understand then what Peter's going to have to learn later. You can do it. It's okay. Again, it's part of the maturity of the mind that the rules of Moses would obsolesce. They would go away. They would mature away. And I think that's the whole issue of ritual impurity to Jesus was, come on, guys, grow up. We don't got to do this anymore. There is no sacred space. There's a division point again. I think I remember having with Mike. Yeah, I did. I remember this one. Again, all done in great fun. What is sacred space today? The Holy Spirit's in the believer. We are sacred space. I've heard that. My point back to Mike would be, well, if we're all sacred space, there's nothing sacred. In other words, I can touch you, why can I touch you? Because to me, if everything's sacred, then nothing is. It just, again, that would be a conversation to have over coffee or shooting buckets. Let's move on. Proposition 8. So Israel's new David had arrived, but with him came the requirement of redefinition. This is Jesus' big moment on stage. God's family now included all Yahweh loyal Gentiles, key phrase, even as they remain Gentile. Never before has this been part of the conversation. Even Ruth and Rahab had to proselytize. No more, right? So redefining the family. I'm not going to read this for time, but notice again, I put it on screen so you can take your time with it if you'd like. That Jesus came to re-identify, well, this line here is important, but this meant that Israel herself needed to change to re-identify herself. This is precisely where Jesus' life and teaching made their mark. Well, let me keep reading. He clarified, sometimes to the horror of Jews and to the curiosity of Gentiles, that Gentiles could join the family of Abraham while remaining Gentile. As long as you worship Yahweh, you're in. Again, that was brand new. The Zacchaeus story, remember this? He's a Jew, probably. We don't know if Zacchaeus is a Jew or a Gentile, but he's a tax collector, so he's an outsider. By the time the story's over, Jesus says, I love the line, today's salvation, now see, this is a salvation story because he's being allowed into the family. Notice how it goes. Today's salvation has come to this house because he didn't pray a prayer. He became a son of Abraham. He joined the family, and that family joining is all part of that ritual purity stuff that we've talked about before. Number 9. Well, we'll get into this next time. The suffering and death of Jesus came as a surprise to all, including those who knew the story. Jesus, do you ever think of this, may also have been kept unaware of the reason behind his suffering. One of the greatest acts of faith that you and I are called to do is to suffer and not know why. You're left speechless sometimes, crumpled on the kitchen floor, wondering, God, why? And to that end, we'll do this next time, but let me give this as an opening shot over the bow, as it were. Why did Jesus die and suffer? It's not just the death issue. Every time Jesus predicts his death, he also predicts his suffering. To him, it was part of the same story. From Jesus' own words, we learn about halfway through his ministry, he wanted others to know that he would suffer a painful death. Scary thought. Number 2, the reason for this death was to be kept private between him and Yahweh. And it's possible Jesus was never told why he had to suffer and die. His question to the Father, is there any other way, to me seems to say there might be another way. And his call from the cross of why have you forsaken me, which is a quote from Psalm 22, which is the standard Jewish way of saying, oh God, where are you? I think was a heartfelt moment of saying, I've lived my whole life in faithfulness to you, Father, and this is what I get. It was an actual statement of pain, of no sense at that time period. This made no sense to Jesus, and like it would make no sense to me. So he joined the human race. How deeply, even in calling out to his Father, oh God, what in the world is going on here? And that's how Hebrews 5:7 seems to fall into place as well. Our last point, the finished work of Christ has often been a phrase. It's not a biblical term, but we use it. I'd like to clarify what I think it should be. When someone talks about trusting in the finished work of Christ, here's what I would recommend that means. His present position of Daniel 7, authority over the cosmos. From here, Jesus completes Abraham's covenant, and he is helping us as a family. He is the head of a family that is loyal to Yahweh. So I'm debating how much of that to read. I don't need to read it to you, right? You can read this. In this sense, Jesus reversed the greatest power known to man outside of himself, physical death. One of the finished works of Jesus is that he overcomes death. Death has been defeated. This is my last slide, and I'd like to read it because to me, why do I love Jesus? When I go to church on Sunday and I'm recommended by the songs and by the sermon to love Jesus, why would I do that? Here's why I would say it to myself. Today we love Jesus because the Father does, and we honor him because the Father has. Why do I love Jesus? Because I get in line with the story. I join a story in which I find that Yahweh is absolutely in love with his Son. We believe that all the varied stories of the Bible draw together into one clear theme. I love this in Paul. He is the yes and amen, an old way of saying he dots every I and crosses every T. Through Jesus, the one who taught us how to trust and enjoy our Creator. We're going to take our next entire module and talk now about the death of Jesus. Evangelicalism, for good reason, has spent a lot of time on the death of Jesus, and we've made it part of our salvation story, so we owe it to ourselves to spend that time. So we'll do that next.